Hey everyone, welcome to CyberSplainers. It's me, Eric, and we're here with yet another hopefully interesting discussion and topic. I'm going to start by asking if anyone knows, I'm not going to say remembers, because most of us, including myself, don't remember, but knows of the car, the Edsel. One example of what we're not going to talk about cars, or the Apple Newton or Google Glass. All of those things are inventions or innovations that at a certain time with a certain perspective had some great potential. But being focused on cybersecurity here at CyberSplainers, we're going to spin that towards cybersecurity innovations, technologies, companies, more concepts that had great potential but never quite panned out. So that's our question: is what cybersecurity innovations have just not quite worked, maybe why, and what can we learn from that? So I have to give credit where credit is due. This topic was actually brought up by my guest today. I've known Steve, I'll introduce in a second, for years. We've had a bunch of great conversations. We're talking about things. We talked about having him on the podcast with something different, not necessarily what he does for a living, but something we're familiar with. And he brought up this idea of talking about cybersecurity ideas and innovations that I want to say failed, but they didn't necessarily fail. And you'll see what we mean as we go through the conversation. I think we'll explore it a little bit. But let me introduce my guest. I'm proud to have him here, Steve Baker, who I've known for years from the vendor side. He's been with partners that I've worked with as an SE for a long time. But now I get to call him my colleague because he works with me at our day jobs at ADS. But Steve, say hi.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for having me on the CyberSplainers podcast. I'm excited to be here. And as you mentioned, we've known each other for, it feels like, a very long time. I've been in the industry since the late 90s, the mid 2000s, been in the cybersecurity space, really just, love technology, love kind of getting my hands dirty and having conversations like this about, what some of our missteps along the way have been. It seemed like a good idea at the time.
Yes, and there's a lot of things like that. The ones I mentioned, like the Edsel, was a infamous car. I want to say, who was it by? Was it Ford? Maybe Buick? I don't even remember, because it was before my time too, but it was just a famous failure. Maybe a more recent one would be the Ford Pinto. That was a little closer to my time. I think I was alive, that had some catastrophic problems. But the Edsel, way before, it was introduced at a time that the style was a little polarizing. People didn't all love it. It was expensive and was introduced just as a recession was hitting, if I have it right, if I have my history lessons correct. And that all led to only a 2-year production time, I think, for a car, which is not a good way to make money on a new car model if you have to can it after a couple of years. The Apple Newton, another example I mentioned in the intro, was a tablet before there were tablets, but it wasn't really. It was something kind of different. The PDA, more like. I actually had, and I should have brought, I have a Pilot, Palm Pilot. Yes. An early PDA. And that didn't fail. It actually succeeded, I think, fairly well, that people know the name, but they didn't always go where they were intended. Google Glass, the other one I mentioned, was a technology that ahead of its time, people weren't really ready for it necessarily, and the tech couldn't quite deliver, if you're familiar with it.
Yeah, I've definitely seen those, and there was quite a bit of buzz about them at one point, but it was, I guess, ahead of its time. if you
well, often that's the case. And we'll get to that. There's reasons for failures. Again, the Edsel, bad timing, maybe some bad focus groups that said they liked it, and ultimately people didn't. But also, again, with recession and financially. But Apple Newton, I think, also ahead of its time, maybe, because I think we've seen offshoots of that actually succeed now. Sure. Maybe an early predecessor to what we call smartphones, and kind of the same thing with the Pilot. That was a early PDA. Google Glass, I think we're even seeing now in VR glasses.
Yep.
And some of the smart glasses, like from Meta and from others, that do parts of what Google Glass was trying to do. I think it was almost too lofty when it was introduced.
And I think that's oftentimes one of the problems with innovative technology, is that they aim for the stars, but you have to get out of the atmosphere first.
Yeah, that's very true. So again, to reel it into CyberSplainers and talk more about cybersecurity, you, I believe, came armed with some ideas and some examples to at least start us off with, again, innovations around cybersecurity that, at least in their time, didn't work out. So where do you want to start?
Man, it's an extensive list, I think, again, and some of it I'm probably dating myself a little bit, just because.
It's all right. We do that all the time here.
One that comes to mind for me, and I lived it, so I think it's a fun one to talk about, is early iterations of data loss prevention. I'm sure you remember those days. And, we won't necessarily name specific vendors, but I think, having a huge infrastructure to inventory your data, and that data inventory taking, weeks or in some cases months before you could even start to think about policies or visibility, at which point that data was probably changed or no longer valid, was definitely a challenging time in the industry. I think, there's a lot of older IT folks that probably have a lot less hair because of early implementations of data loss prevention.
Yeah, I think even the initialism itself of DLP was problematic because I think there were, for the L and the P at least, there were different words. It could have been data loss or data leakage, and prevention or protection. And I heard all different permutations of that, all 4 different combinations, data loss, used interchangeably, even though there are subtle differences. Is it loss protection or loss prevention or leakage prevent? Anyway, so right off the bat, it's trying to cover a lot. It's all data in all directions, which, was that really necessary?
And was it really possible at
That's
the
the big
time? And I think when you think about that, when you take that, even just getting a handle around the data, but when you take that a step further, not every 9-digit number is a social security number. Something we used to struggle with quite a bit. If you saw a number that looked like it could be a social security number or a credit card number, you were relying on things like basic regex or something of that nature to say, yep, that's something I need to prevent from leaking. If we use the data leak prevention acronym, it was really challenging. And a lot of folks struggled with, I'm never going back to this. I'm not going to look at it again because it's not ready. We're not there. We don't really need this. I'm sure you had some of those conversations.
Or do what I need. I need it. And I think it starts with there's a need, there's a problem, there's something that needs to be solved. And that's what leads to these ideas. You don't just invent something that nobody cares about or needs and think, oh, I'm going to solve this problem that doesn't exist. It was intended to solve a problem that existed. Companies were losing proprietary information through different means. It was getting outside where it's not supposed to, or getting corrupted or being shared in various ways. And the idea was to try and stop that or prevent that or protect our data.
Sure. And actually, I think it even went a step further than that in some cases. I was working in the healthcare industry at that time, and that was around when the HIPAA regulations started to become something that organizations needed to adhere to. And so part of that was, hey, we need to protect PII or any type of personally identifiable information. And so data loss prevention seemed like a good idea.
Well, it was a good idea. Again, maybe the goals were too lofty.
Sure.
Because when we look at it in hindsight now, being 2020, now that we're decades past when that was an early initiative, we look at the challenges we came across. One was just the data sprawl itself. There was so much data that we had to look at and classify and decide what to protect, what not to protect, that our compute power and our bandwidth and our capabilities technically at that time couldn't really keep up. You were closer to it, I think, where you were at the time, but I was seeing it from this side. And I just think we couldn't really deliver at the scale we needed to make it successful.
The technology didn't exist at the time to be able to implement it effectively.
And then if you're properly encrypting your data 15 plus years ago, you couldn't see what was being sent. You couldn't see what was being transmitted. And that's still a problem today when we talk about encryption, which is good. It also makes security sometimes harder.
It definitely does.
And at the time, there was no way to decrypt. And even if there was, the speed of compute made it prohibitive to try and decrypt encrypted data.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think when we talk about that one, I think that's a failure turned into a success. You think about where we were, what a long, strange trip it's been, right? Where we were and where we are today, because the technology has caught up. So we have much faster compute. We have much better, we have machine learning and AI that we can now leverage within a data. And we've also shifted terminology a little bit. Very few companies call it data loss or data leak prevention. Now it's data protection. And I think that, one is to get away from the old name because it has a little bit of bad history around it, but also because what we're actually protecting is data that we've classified as important. And so I think it's just changed the conversation a little bit. And again, the technology has caught up. And now I would say that, most organizations, and I certainly feel this way, data protection is a key component of cybersecurity. but it took us a long time to get there.
Yeah. But I think sometimes starting that journey a little too early at least gets you ready. We're seeing that now, not to go off topic too much, but with PQC and preparing for quantum computing. We can't solve it now. We can't start encrypting our data stronger because we don't have it yet. But we can start laying the foundation so that when we do have quantum capabilities, we can encrypt our data better. And that's a whole different topic we will be covering. I promise we want to do this one right. But quantum is a huge, interesting challenge that we can't solve until we have it. And then it's almost too late. But we know it's coming, kind of like Y2K. We knew it was coming. Let's prep and try and make sure the planes don't fall out of the sky, which most of us knew they weren't. Anyway, I said I wasn't going to get too far off topic, but I just did it.
Right,
you just
there.
watched
you
me.
Went right
but
Y2K.
It's an example of laying the foundation still can be good. So even if it doesn't work, if it fails, a lot of money and time was invested in it, that doesn't all go to waste if we can learn lessons from it that we apply later.
Well, and I think that's a really important point, whether you're talking about, technologies that were a bit of a flop or even just things we went through like Y2K. We learned a lot from that, not only from a technology perspective, but just about problem solving in general. And I think it taught us some lessons. It may have given some of us a little bit of PTSD, but overall we came out of it better, right? We learned and we evolved, and the technology, grew based on capabilities catching up and things like that. So ultimately, it put us in a better place today, but I wouldn't want to relive it.
Yeah. No, well, going back again, almost 30 years ago to IDS, intrusion detection systems, which at the time was a great idea. We're seeing traffic that looks like it's okay, but it's really not. We can block it at the perimeter, but intrusion detection didn't actually block it. It just detected it. And I had stories I won't share here of people asking for IDS because it's going to help them be more secure. And no, it's not. It's going to give you better visibility, but you actually need to do something to prevent that stuff. And within a couple of years, IDS was gone and IPS had taken its place.
Can I share?
And not that either was a failure, but it's that learning and evolving. Go ahead, share.
So I have to share a fun IDS story, and this goes back, man, over 25 years. So I was young in my career at that point, and I was working for a company. Won't name the company to protect the innocent, but I was the first thing when I came on board. The first thing they tasked me with was getting a handle on their IDS system, and so gave me some credentials and said, "Hey, log into this environment and take a look." And they had these sensors all over the place that were connected to network taps, and we're gathering information and allegedly reporting back if there was something going on in their environment. So we logged in, and again, back then, these were black boxes that basically ran a Linux OS and had a sniffer on them, and we're then doing some analysis. Logged in and just poking around, and I get onto a device and I see, I'm looking to see who else has access, and I see all these user accounts. I'm like, wow, that's interesting. And so, reach out to the vendor, and they're like, well, you should just have the accounts that you set up. 50. And it turns out that the IDS devices had all been compromised. And so, I think it's pretty interesting. Again, IDS at the time was something that a lot of organizations were trying to get. They didn't have good visibility into their environment. They wanted to get better visibility, but that with great power comes great responsibility. And so what they had inadvertently done is given an attacker, a malicious actor, access to all of their traffic. That was a fun one to go to my boss to at the time and say, "Hey, just have to break this news to you." Yeah, it's definitely interesting. You're bringing up IDS and how it evolved into IPS made me remember that story, which I hadn't thought about in many, many years.
Yeah. Well, and this is what happens. You reminded me of an example that I think one of the lessons is sometimes you can have a false sense of security.
Sure.
Because they thought, I have an IDS, I'm good. You lapse in certain other areas when you find out actually it's not really doing any good. And I had one of my old legacy examples from, again, close to 30 years ago, early firewall days. Client was all happy they had a new firewall. I was working on something else with them, and we started discussing the firewall, and they said, "Oh, it's great. What's so great about it?" Just furthering the conversation. Now we don't have to worry about our patches as much. Okay, I get that. You've got perimeter security where you had none before, but let's look at it. They show me their policy, any except. Wide open rule. Essentially a router, not really a firewall. Because there was no intrusion prevention at the time. There was no added defense in depth on a firewall. It was just a router with an ACL, basically, with no ACL, basically. I pointed out to them that it's not really doing them any good. And in fact, I've made the argument it lowered their level of security because they were being less diligent about patches because they had this incorrect sense of security. So their firewall made them less secure.
Is that, again, an interesting, just thinking back on things, there prior to firewalls, or when firewalls started becoming a lot more widespread, everyone was moving from ACLs. And the argument was, well, these ACLs are really complex. And we have all these rules or these policies, but if we put in a firewall, it's going to be much easier. And your point is well taken, in that a lot of times what that looked like early on was, let's put in a firewall with an any rule, and somehow that was better than our complex ACLs. So it's an interesting.
Here comes one of my really simplified analogies. It's like having seatbelts in your car, but not putting them on. My car has seatbelts. I'm good.
That's a great one.
You're not. Anyway, so to pull it back in, DLP failed at the time because it couldn't deliver on what we really needed, because it has to be, I think, comprehensive to really do you any good. If you're not blocking every possible avenue or controlling every possible avenue for that data to leak, you're missing it. You block it at the firewall, that's fine. But if somebody's plugging in a thumb drive and taking the data home with them onto their home computer that's not secured, you almost might as well not bother. Absolutely. So I think part of the challenge was it couldn't be as pervasive as it needed to be, or we weren't ready to make it so. But now,
now it's a key part of almost every cybersecurity architecture. You have to have data protection, whether that's because your organization requires it, whether it's because of regulatory requirements, whether it's just because that's what your cybersecurity policy demands that you have. And now we're able to do it much more effectively. Again, to your point, the technology has caught up, and we have a better understanding of how to implement it successfully. And we're not so reliant on regex anymore.
I think that's a key takeaway, is that it is possible now. For anyone, pay attention here. For anyone who ruled out DLP because it failed in the past or was too hard or too expensive, you need to look into it again. And I say this again, without trying to sell anything, I think it's because there are those people out there that had a bad experience with it and have kind of moved on to other things. They've got other priorities. It's worth invigorating that, because it is doable now with better tech, with better solutions. And it's possible in ways it wasn't 10, 15, never mind 20 years ago.
Absolutely.
But look at it as data protection, not DLP. That's kind of the updated term, and look at it with new life. Of course, we're happy to help you. But again, I don't like to sell here. But so the DLP is one example. We've learned a lot from it. I think it's ready again now. But do you have another?
Oh, the list is long.
We might have even touched on a couple in that conversation.
I think we did, but I'm gonna go with one of another old favorite of mine is password rotation, 90-day password rotation, and password complexity.
Passwords in general.
Yeah. Because if I force my users to change their password every 90 days, that's much better than having the same password for an extended period of time.
But what if every time they change it, it's still a bad password?
What if every time they change it, they write it on a piece of paper and put it under their keyboard?
Yeah.
And a lot of that kind of implementation was before we had things like password management. So people did do that. They did write it down, or they did use, their dog's name with a 1 after it or a 2 after it, maybe an exclamation point thrown in there. But it really didn't help us with security all that much.
Yeah, it's an interesting, I think this is a bigger discussion in and of itself. And we've actually done this on an episode. We've talked about authentication and the importance and the mismanagement of it. And I think some of the foibles and definitely a lot of failures along there. And I still don't think we have it right. I think one of the challenges, we have too many things we have to authenticate to, and they're all disconnected. In that utopian alternate universe where it all works, we have one single digital identity that's used everywhere, and it's, can't be imitated. I don't have a solution that will make this happen, but ideally, because we don't have that, we have all these disconnected authentication systems, and everyone has their own rules and policies on what makes a good password, or multiple factors, or whatever.
Well, and I think that's one of the most interesting things around the original idea of password rotation and password complexity is, and I've been around for a while, you've been around for a while. It wasn't really based on any factual information. It was maybe it was part of a standard that was published at some point. Well, this is a good idea, but there was never any way to actually quantify whether it was making you more secure. That I've seen. I don't know what your thoughts
But
are.
the closest I'd seen was some statistics and numbers around brute force and around dictionary attacks, where yes, using a dictionary word is less secure because you can have this dictionary of hundreds of thousands of words and just try all those versus the millions of combinations based on the numbers of characters. If they're random characters, yes, it's harder. You have to brute force versus dictionary, but you're also going to write it down.
You're going to write it down, or you're going to get aggravated that you have to change it every 90 days or 30 days or whatever you were, required to do. And you're going to either try to find a way around that, or you're just going to do whatever makes it the least difficult for you. And I think, again, it's another example of something that has evolved over time.
I think one of the ways you can see that evolution is just in what's required by most systems when you're defining a password.
Sure.
And yet they're not consistent. Some are requiring punctuation and numbers and upper and lower case and all this and 20 characters, whereas others are 8 characters. As long as it's not a dictionary word, I don't care what it is.
And why can I use an exclamation point on this system, but not on this system?
And it's that lack of consistency.
It's definitely created some challenges. It's definitely, but we've evolved. It's another situation in which we've evolved over time, right? So, I think people still require passwords to be changed. Whether I don't see a lot of people asking for 90 days anymore. It tends to be longer. Maybe it's 180, maybe it's 365, maybe it's not at all because you're using MFA. Maybe you are requiring users to use a password manager that generates a random password and then they don't care.
Yeah.
And you're still backing that up with some form of MFA. We're seeing a lot with passkeys now as well. That's another kind of change in, how people are approaching that. I don't think they're as widely distributed. I think that's going to continue. I think we'll continue to see enhancement there. I know, Microsoft's been talking about a lot of things around passwordless authentication. That's a whole topic in and of itself that folks have different views on. But it's definitely something that I think the reason I brought that one up next is when we were talking about IDS a few minutes ago, you talked about that false sense of security, and I do think that the password complexity, changes every 30 or 90 days. I worked for some place that you had to change it every 90 days, or every 30 days. I think that those weren't really giving us the level of security that we thought they would.
That's interesting. You mentioned MFA, and it's a big topic. Again, we've talked about it already in some depth, but I always like to bring up the example of an ATM card and the idea that your bank will let you access your money. This is the most, this isn't a, crypto or access to your accounts like online. This is your actual cash. You can go to the ATM and withdraw your cash as long as you have the card and know the PIN. Simplest 2-factor auth that you can have. And yet what made me think of it was when you mentioned having to change passwords, and some you never change. When's the last time you changed your ATM PIN? Have you ever changed your ATM PIN? How do you change it? You have to call the bank probably. And this is one of those, I use it as an example because it's good enough for the bank.
Right.
It should be good enough for us. And the PIN is not highly complex. It's all numeric digits, maybe 4, 6, possibly 8 of them, or somewhere in between. And I will confess, I'm not supposed to talk about it. I haven't changed mine in decades.
Yeah,
I don't know that I ever have. And yet, as long as I have my card, I know you don't, and I know it's fairly safe. And that's really the strength and the power of MFA.
Yep, it absolutely is.
Yeah. So I guess that's one of those arguments is for those that are leveraging MFA for their organization, should you still also force password changes?
I would argue that if you have consistent MFA across your entire environment, and I do mean that, where you are using MFA everywhere, that changing passwords probably isn't all that important in terms of enhancing your
passwords are probably the weakest factor.
I would agree with that. And, I would also even go a step further and say, I don't see a lot of reasons why you shouldn't be using MFA everywhere, both from an enterprise perspective and also from a personal perspective. If you look at how easy it is to use MFA today. And I realize some MFA is better. Not all MFAs are created the same.
If you have to pick up your phone every 2 minutes to authenticate to something else,
it's not great. But if you look at, you can certainly use some of the free authenticators out there. Most password managers have MFA built into them where you can do one-time passwords. Again, are they perfect? No, but they enhance your security exponentially than just using a password. I often laugh. I'm sure everybody has experienced this when someone says, "Oh, my Facebook account got hacked, my Twitter account or X account, whatever it's called these days, got compromised," and you say, "Well, did you have multi-factor authentication turned on?" And they're like, "No, that's a pain."
Yeah.
I mean, this is not a challenge, but mine has never been compromised because since day one, it's supported at, if nothing else, SMS, and that was better than just a password.
It's one of those better than nothing.
Yeah.
Not the best, but
Absolutely.
better than nothing or better than any single factor. So to try and resolve this, it's not that, well, maybe it is that arbitrary password complexity and arbitrary expiration times have kind of failed as the standalone measure for better authentication. I think that with the computing power that brute force has ultimately, the idea was that rotation, say it's 30 days. The idea is if your password can be compromised or hacked or whatever in 30 days, by the time they get it, it's too late because now you've changed it. And that's kind of like survival time for encryption keys. It should take longer to decrypt or break those keys than those keys live for, so that we're constantly moving on.
And I think that would be valid if the mechanism by which those passwords were if that was the way that people were getting those passwords. I don't know. Again, we've been around for a while. I didn't see a lot of accounts getting hacked by brute force. It was more social engineering, people writing things down and losing them, throwing their passwords on a USB stick.
But the more complex and the more frequently they had to be changed, the more people were writing them down.
Sure.
And that's where I think that in theory it failed because of the actual implementation led to a lapse in other security concepts.
Absolutely.
And yet I don't like to be so negative. So it's not that it's just failed, but there's better ways to do it now. We've answered that with other technologies, primarily MFA, which I agree everyone should be considering it for pretty much everything as a much better solution. The other thing that I think has evolved to help make this less of a challenge and less of a pain is some more unity within authentication, allowing a single authentication source to be leveraged by multiple systems, not just, let's say, O365, where all of your different apps, you can authenticate once and maybe it's a corporate identity, but maybe if your corporate identity is also being used for your other SaaS applications and others, at least you've got this one identity you're logging in as across multiple systems. And that's something that we continue to see evolve. I don't know that we'll ever reach the point that it's unified where all systems are using one identity for you. That would be, again, that utopian solution. I proved to my computer I'm me. Now everybody knows. I think you approach that with some of the password managers because the password manager then authenticates you to all the other systems. You just have to authenticate to that one place. But that's just kind of a proxy.
Right. It absolutely is. And even that, I think, it's still not a single identity that's tied to you as an individual. I mean, your accounts are all in one place. You have all of your, authentication information. Sometimes your one-time passwords, MFA within it. That's great, but that can still be compromised. Much harder. It's exponentially harder, but you still, I agree with you that we're still not at a point where, I can, as Steve Baker, can reuse my identity almost like a machine identity across multiple platforms. Yeah. Maybe we'll get there. Maybe we won't. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that would be what would end this discussion. But two other interesting points. You mentioned the password manager, where yes, it does make certain things easier, but it also means if somebody compromises your password manager, they've got all of it. And that's one of those other fears. It's a valid fear. I've heard it brought up many times. There have been examples in the past of online password managers that have had breaches. And now whoever breaches it knows everybody's password to everything. Largely been mitigated, and that won't happen anymore in that way. That's one concern. The other interesting one that I had read years ago, you talk about statistics and doing measurements on password complexity and how that translates to real world. I had read a paper that really intrigued me, and I loved the idea of it, that said instead of using random characters and complexity, I think it was at the time that they figured that the most beneficial was 3 words, 3 dictionary words, names, whatever, and just use the 3 of them in succession. And it makes it a long password, not truly random, but the complexity, because they're three disconnected words: cup, mouse, table. That connection of those three words is incredibly hard to brute force or to dictionary attack. But I'm only remembering three things. And that was the idea, is you should not have to write that down.
Yep.
What was my password again? Cup, mouse, table. Easy. And it's relatively quick to type. And I love that concept. There are a couple places I've used something similar to that, where I need to have a unique password, but it's not super sensitive and there's no MFA option. I'm just like, I'm not saying that's the end all be all way to do your passwords, but as a concept, I love that idea.
No, and I think that that's where that, and I'm trying to remember back exactly when that kind of became a thing, but that was the shift from you need a 8 to 12 character complex password to you should use a passphrase of something, whether it was 3 words or whether it was, the brown cow jumped over the moon or whatever with an exclamation point at the end. It didn't, that did kind of start that shift to like, let's be a little more reasonable about this.
I think the creativity behind it and think about it a little differently. And I'm always a fan of, let's take a step back from what hasn't been working, and all of our little patches haven't made it better. Let's take a step back and rethink how we're doing this. And that was the huge one. And I think it was actually before I was in cybersecurity, I was doing networking and some other stuff. I had a client that had a password, and they had to share it with me. This is when you did this, because they were the only account that could log into the system I was working on. So they had to give me their password, and they did. And it made no sense. It was random sounding letters. And I finally asked, what is that? And it was the first letter of each word in a phrase. Yep. And it was a very off-color phrase. And I remember her blushing as she told me what it stood for. I was like, okay. But I never forgot. I think I might have actually used it a couple of times just because it's memorable and reconstructable. But it'd be incredibly difficult to randomly. Anyway, just we could go on and on again. Other episode about authentication and MFA specifically, but yeah, I'd agree that the arbitrary password complexity and rotation did not solve our authentication problems, but it led to other innovation that has made it better.
It has, and I think that innovation continues, right? And I know you and I were having this conversation earlier about something else. Given how important identity is to everything, this is something that we're going to continue to see evolve, and hopefully we'll continue to get better and better at it. Maybe someday we'll get to that unique identifier per kind of
I agree.
Individual.
Identity is fundamental to everything we do, and I don't think it gets the attention it deserves, but that's another discussion for another day. So what else do you have as another example?
All right. I feel like this one's kind of a layup, but we should still talk about it.
Those are okay. Layups are nice every now and then.
So let's talk about signature-based AV, as I would argue a flop from the beginning.
Okay. Oh, I might go in its defense for a little bit.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So here's the thing about that. If you look at antivirus, signature-based antivirus, going back to, I would say in the mid 90s is when it really you started to see it everywhere. That adoption continued to grow through the early 2000s, 2000, and then eventually it changed. But if you think about when some of the early antivirus products came out and you started to see them, in business environments, on personal computers, things like that. Well, polymorphic malware already existed. Some of the first malware that could go and change its hash, or some of the first viruses that could go and change their hashes or generate new variants came out in the 1990s. There's a virus family called Chameleon, I think it was. I think it was originally developed in 1990. We weren't really talking about antivirus back then. But, as I saw, and I'm sure you saw the same thing, over time, antivirus was a critical part of our cybersecurity program. Every computer needed to have antivirus. Every workstation, every PC, every server, we needed it wherever we could get it.
And then at the perimeter.
At the perimeter.
Gateways, yeah.
Yep, absolutely. But it was always something that could be circumvented. It got rid of some of the low-hanging fruit, which is certainly good. Get rid of the things that are just out there, protect against them. But it really didn't protect us from the extremely dangerous malware and viruses.
I think when you initially brought it up, my initial objection was I'll go back further into the 80s. Where viruses were a thing. And at that point, they were all static, identifiable via signatures. We didn't really have polymorphic in any prevalence, if it even existed. And partly because we didn't have the internet the way we do today. So I'd say prior to the internet, we still had AV, but viruses were being transmitted via physical medium, disks, from computer to computer be infected. And there was no way for those to morph themselves, really. It wasn't functional. There was no central way. So I think in the earlier virus days, it was valid to use signatures. And yet it still wasn't a perfect solution because signatures, again, prior to the internet, had to be updated manually somehow. I still remember you could log on to, and this talk about dating yourself, log into CompuServe and download the latest McAfee.dat file and put it into the folder where your AV was. And that was how you updated your antivirus. And if you didn't update it, you wouldn't know about any new stuff. And again, goes back to that false sense of security where people would think, oh, I've got AV, I'm good. I can do that thing. I can click that thing because I've got antivirus. If you're not diligent about it, you might as well not.
Right.
But at that point, I think signature was all we had and was all we were afraid of. But to your point, as things evolve, our solutions need to evolve with them. And I don't think it did as quickly as it needed to.
Correct. And I think, there is an argument to be made that better than nothing security is better than nothing.
If you're eliminating 90% of the noise, at least you're doing something.
Right. But it's still, again, I think it created I can remember a number of situations over the years. And again, I'm sure you remember some of these as well, where somebody had an incident, malware incident, virus or a Trojan or a worm in their environment, and they didn't understand. I have antivirus. Why is this happening? Well, because antivirus isn't going to pick that up because it's polymorphic or this is a different variant. I can remember having some uncomfortable conversations with customers over the years about that. And so that's why I kind of put it in that category of, call it a flop, call it something that was maybe not as effective as we thought it was. Now, it is probably the one, though, that we have learned the most from and has changed our approach to cybersecurity more than almost anything else, because now we're at a point where we talk about, EDR type solutions, NDR type solutions, and those were developed in the industry because of the need to get away from signature-based technology, which we had to do because, again, they weren't effective going back to when we started using them. Again, notwithstanding your example of, offline computers in the 80s.
When it was a simpler world. Less functional, but simpler.
It was definitely a simpler world. But we had to evolve. We needed things that could look at, behavioral analytics, do behavioral analysis, understand context of what was particular application or executable was trying to do. Was it beaconing out to look for computers on my network? Was it, trying to encrypt files, as we've seen,
or delete them, or delete before files. That, just to wreak havoc early on.
So that evolution had to happen, and ultimately those early failures with some of the antivirus technology, signature-based technology, taught us a lot of lessons that have helped us a ton today. And so, sometimes we have to learn a hard lesson and then come out better for it. And I do think some of that early antivirus put us in a better position today, but it just wasn't all that effective when we were using it.
Yeah. Well, I'd also argue that with evolution of other things come evolution of solutions like antivirus. For example, automatic online regular updating. It's a trivial issue. We don't think about it. The right solutions will update themselves on a very regular basis because we can assume internet connectivity almost all the time. We don't have to manually download updates to keep it up to date. The other one is just raw compute power, making things like sandboxing a viable option. To have unknown content actually be detonated in a sandbox to see what it does, to monitor its behavior in a safe environment and know whether or not it's safe, even with a 0 day, which we couldn't have imagined doing 20 years ago, at least not, especially not in real time. To sandbox a piece of content and still deliver it in a timely manner wouldn't have happened back then.
No, and I mean, I think that's a great point. And even, talking about sandboxing technology, whether it's, from a traffic analysis standpoint, overall, or from a behavioral analysis standpoint overall. I mean, even as recently as 5 or 6 years ago, we didn't have the technology to sandbox real time. Right? You would send something to be sandboxed, but you would have to make a decision as to whether you were going to block that connection while you were sandboxing, or if you were going to allow it. And then if something came back as malicious, sever the connection, because we couldn't do it at speed. Yeah. That's changed now. Now I think, most sandboxing technology can do it real time as traffic is flowing, which is a pretty incredible evolution when you think about where we came from.
Yeah, it makes me think about the potential, again, application for quantum with making sandboxing trivial and fast. So again, I don't want to oversell quantum because it has a lot of power requirements. It's not like it'll be free compute, free massive compute. But again, sandboxing is limited by speed and performance of emulating that environment, detonating that content, and seeing what it does as quickly as we can. And it's not perfect, but it is definitely, if you compare that to signature based, you're talking about polar opposite methods that are different.
Absolutely. And, I think that said something when you were talking about sandboxing, there's the whole aspect now of understanding what good and bad actually looks like too. And that's a big thing that signature based AV didn't necessarily, because signatures could be wrong.
Right.
We had false positives even when we were using, we definitely had false negatives.
Sure.
But we absolutely had false positives as well, where, for some reason, a signature matched legitimate traffic or a legitimate file or something like that. I think one of the most interesting evolutions to me of sandboxing, and again, EDR and different technologies like that, is their ability to understand good and bad behavior and then wrap, a verdict around that. Are they perfect? No, but they are miles ahead of where we were 20 years ago.
Yeah, agreed. So signature-based AV, when it's all you have, you didn't even call it signature-based AV, it was called AV. But when it's version 1 isn't called version 1, usually it's called by its name. And when it's all you have.
That's a great point.
It's all you have. So we had AV, and AV was a good idea. But the foundational concept behind it showed its lackings very quickly with polymorphism and things that needed to evolve quickly. And I don't think the solution evolved as quickly as the threat. And that's often the case because we think we have AV, we've checked the box, even though it's signature based, we don't know the difference. And we move on to other things, but the threats continue to evolve.
And, I think one thing with all of these is hindsight's always 20.
Sure. Right. Well, hopefully, eventually hindsight. So sometimes it takes us a lot longer than it should have.
It's always easy to get there, but hindsight's always 2020. So I want to turn it around though for a second. I want to ask you what's one of your.
Oh, geez, I'm not prepared for these.
I don't believe that for a minute.
I've got a bunch. Well, I'll bring up one that we touched on earlier that I thought you might have brought up eventually was HTTPS inspection. And this is not so much a failed technology. It's something that we know is a problem. We know it's a challenge. We just don't have a valid solution yet at the scale we need it. There are solutions. There's a bunch of different solutions. The problem basically being that encryption works. It does what it's supposed to do. It allows a device or a user to communicate with a server or service and encrypt it from end to end so that prying eyes can't see the data, the content. And that's a good thing. It's a good protective thing. But with security admins and tools and devices in the middle trying to protect the user and the data and others, they want to see in it for good reasons. And HTTPS and other forms of encryption make that much more challenging. And yet that encryption doesn't differentiate between good intent and bad intent in its encryption. So the reason I mentioned we see it playing out, we see it in DLP, even current iterations of DLP. If you can't see the decrypted clear text of the data, you can't make a determination whether this should be allowed or not. We also see it in malware with antivirus. If you can't see the content in its original form, you can't make a determination of whether or not it's safe. So overarching all of our cybersecurity goals, encrypted data does what it's supposed to do, but it makes certain security initiatives much more challenging. And I just don't think we have a end-all be-all solution yet. And I don't know that we ever will.
Yeah, I mean, I think every single, I don't like to make definitive statements like that. Almost every single aspect of a cybersecurity program requires us to have visibility in order to enforce policy. And so I think this has been one of the lack of widespread decryption for good purposes is one of our absolute biggest issues from a cybersecurity perspective. You can have the best perimeter security in the world. You can have the best data protection solution in the world. If you can't see the data, you can't do anything. And so, I remember, dealing with banking customers 15 years ago that, because I think they were some of the early adopters of HTTPS decryption, SSL decryption. And I can remember dealing with several banks that were banging their head against that because they understood how critical it was. We have to be able to see this traffic. How can we protect our users and our customers and their 4 or 6 digit pins, like we were talking about earlier, if we can't see the traffic. And there were so many challenges. There was certificate chains not lining up, or certificate pinned applications that were causing problems. Although I think that's becoming less and less these days. It's still an issue, but it's not as prevalent as it was because almost everything's web-based. But the thing is that dissuaded a ton of people from even looking at it. Not to mention the fact that our compute power wasn't there.
Right.
You might be an organization that needed a tiny firewall. If you were just letting traffic flow and maybe in putting some policies in place, maybe you were doing some limited IDS IPS. But if you wanted to do decryption, you were looking at a box 5 or 10 times larger than what you actually needed to get the throughput. A lot of that has changed, and you're seeing SASE solutions implemented at a client level. You're seeing browser solutions implemented at the browser level. Sure, you still need it at a network level, but I think that even that's become much, much easier. But and I don't know what you see, but I know in the conversations I have with, despite the fact that 89 to 90% of traffic is encrypted at this point, I would say maybe 20% of organizations are doing SSL decryption, and that's probably high.
And that's the point. Is it's not that it's failed; it's that we haven't figured out the right way to do it at scale to then add all the security capabilities and expertise that we want to that encrypted traffic. There are solutions. Now this isn't to say that it can't be done. And a lesson is it can be done. There are solutions that allow you to have insight into encrypted traffic at various levels. But that's part of the problem with the dissolution of the perimeter. There are gateway solutions that allow you on a firewall, a lot of traditional firewalls or other gateway solutions, to inspect the data that's going in and out. Most of the data that's going in and out, because there's always going to be exceptions, because there's certificate issues and pinning issues, and certain applications are going to need exceptions. But they're doing a pretty good job at the perimeter if properly employed and scaled and given the right power. Also seeing that shift to a lot of it being done at the endpoint or in the cloud via endpoint, and things like SASE and Secure Web Gateway, where there's almost a more logical way for that encrypted traffic to go to a cloud provider, a clearinghouse, or proxy, essentially whatever you want to call it, that can then inspect if it has the right tooling and capabilities to add the protection. But so we're starting to see this being addressed in various ways, but it's I know still a challenge, as you said, for many, many organizations, and a lot of that traffic that they can't see.
It's fundamentally it's a part of it is a plumbing problem, right? So think about plumbing in your house, right? You don't necessarily care what the pipes in the wall look like. You care about the faucet that you have or the fixture in your bathtub. And I look at SSL decryption like that a lot, because we spend a lot of time, and I'll get there. I can see that.
I love it. I love an analogy. I'm dying to see
the reason why I think it matters is, when you're talking about a cybersecurity challenge and how you want to solve it, right? Maybe that's SASE, maybe that's data protection, maybe that's next generation firewall, whatever the case may be. And you're talking to your organization about it. That's the faucet, right? Like, hey, this is this cool technology that we're going to put in place. It's going to improve our cybersecurity. And
nice, shiny, polished chrome.
Exactly. It's going to look great. It's going to, the interface is awesome. It's easy to manage.
You can just tap it and the water turns on. It's great.
All of that stuff. But how effective is it really if the plumbing, i.e. SSL decryption, isn't in place to allow you to see what you want to use that cool shiny thing to control? And so that's why I say it's kind of a plumbing problem. I don't think we as practitioners, most organizations, and I'm generalizing a bit, but we're not having that conversation about how fundamental it is to our cybersecurity program and how important it is and how much it facilitates all those cool tools we want to have and bells and whistles we have. And it's hard. It's not easy to implement, but ultimately, I think if you talk to anyone that's been at an organization that's implemented it and implemented it well, they are miles ahead in terms of their visibility. Now, does that mean they're doing everything else right? Maybe, maybe not. But just the visibility aspect alone is worth the effort. And it's only going to continue. We talk about post-quantum, we talk about AI and what role that plays in malware and threats and things like that. Well, the time that we have to identify what's actually happening in our environment is getting shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. that means we can't be blind to what's actually happening. So we have to solve that, and we have to solve it.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I brought it up. It's one of
great
those. I mean, I'm sure I could come up with others, but I think all of these in general, there's a commonality to all of them when we talk about cybersecurity, as opposed to things like the Edsel, which was just a failure. The Apple Newton was a failure that led to other things eventually, perfecting and tweaking it. But I think that's more like what we're talking about. Everything in cybersecurity that has failed, I think all the examples we mentioned weren't outright, that was a bad idea. It was a good idea with good intention to solve a challenge. It just couldn't quite deliver for various reasons that over time and with advancements eventually did. So they were all helpful. They were kind of building blocks for where we are now. And the existing problems will eventually be looked at that way once those problems are solved. So I think that's a positive. I'm trying to look at the silver lining to all this is while they were failures in their day and in their time, they helped lead to the successes that have come since.
Yeah, and I think they also teach us a more fundamental lesson, is that just because it was hard or didn't work at the time doesn't mean it's not worth revisiting. Because I think, we talked about it with data loss prevention, where a lot of people are really hesitant to go down that road because it was not fun if you were an early adopter or someone that tried to early adopt some of those technologies.
Invested a lot of time, a lot of money, and never really got the reward.
Yeah,
because it couldn't quite deliver.
But that doesn't mean you shouldn't look at it again. Same with SSL. SSL decryption is another one. I think those are probably the two best examples that we talked about today of things that people have become hesitant to look at because of how challenging they were. But it really, times have changed and things have evolved. Technology has, the technology supporting these types of solutions has gotten much better, and we understand them better.
Yeah, I agree. Were there any more you had in your back pocket you want to share, or should we kind of wrap it up?
It depends on how deep you want to go. There's, again, the list is pretty long and fun, but I think we could beat that horse to death, but I think we highlighted kind of where I was going with the original idea for sitting down and talking today, with some of the things that were struggles along the way. And we got to tell a couple of good stories.
Yeah. And if you can learn from it, it wasn't wasted.
No,
that's my one of my takeaways. The things we can learn from, find value in it somewhere, even if it costs a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of heartache. Come out stronger.
And a bunch of people that didn't know what an Edsel was now know what it is.
If you don't look it up, they're funny looking. Nowadays, they might look really cool. Like if you could find one, they're probably also worth a whole lot of money. Pinto, not so much.
There's going to be some Pinto lover out there.
I'm not saying on either side. I just, industry wide, they've had their issues. That wasn't about look or style. That was that they blew up more often than they should. Anyway, maybe we'll just do it again. We'll spin it up a little bit differently sometime. I'd love to have you back. And it's been a lot of fun though. Thanks again, Steve, for joining me. Thank you all for listening in and joining both of us. And we'll see you next time. Stay safe.
Thanks for having me, Eric.